Good morning, everybody, to our second session in the summit on the Olympics. And if anybody was expecting me to be Sir John Major, I'm very sorry, you missed him. He was yesterday. Yesterday they had a fantastic session on healthy cities and the Olympics, and many wise things were said. One of them that I remember particularly from Sir John was invest once and invest wisely. And that's certainly very good context for our talk about legacy and planning strategies today. Because in around 267 weeks' time, if the maths is correct, Tokyo will be the Olympic city. And I think, as far as Prime Minister Abe says, let me quote him, that it will be an explosive agent for the national economy and will put Tokyo at the center of the world. Well, of course, you'll have 10,000 athletes coming here. You'll have 8.5 million visitors, all experiencing the wonders of new iconic facilities, of renovated facilities, connected by efficient infrastructure and supported by state-of-the-art technology. So this really very much will lift Tokyo to the new international status that the city wants. And just as in 1964, the Olympics then transformed Japan and Tokyo, this, the most compact, the most innovative, the greenest Olympics, will do the same. That's the aim for what's going to happen in Tokyo 2020. Now, I think that really, though, today, we have the question of the test, because the real test happens when the visitors leave, when they take back to their countries across the world that vital international impression of what Tokyo's become. And in fact, we might think back to the age-old Greek motto, the Olympic original motto of higher, faster, stronger. And it applies just as much to the city these days as it does to the athletes themselves. Well, of course, there's lots of challenges to come when we're thinking about Tokyo 2020. But one of the great things, I think, and certainly at the core of ULI philosophy, is the question of best practice. And we are thrilled to have here today our panel who have been in the nitty-gritty of Olympics before, who have seen the highs and lows, experienced the detail, and they're going to help us understand this big question of how you plan now for a legacy afterwards. So let me introduce with great pleasure our panelists. So we have Joel Finlay, who is Head of Sport and Global Event Practice at KPMG. Now, Joel was a real advisor to the Vancouver Olympics and to what happened up in Whistler. And his thing, I think, very much is really how you do this detail of what happens to venues post-Olympics and the engagement you have to get beforehand. And is going to tell us a little bit about that in a moment. Now, we have Andy Altman. You might see only 2 people on this panel. We actually have 3. And we have a computer version in our little double here of Andy Altman, who very kindly at 10 o'clock at night is beaming in from Washington, D.C. Are you there, Andy?
Yes, I'm here.
Yay, look at that. So we thank you for that. And Andy is currently principal founder of Streetscape Partners, and of course was previously the founding chief executive of the Olympic Park Legacy Committee for London 2012, responsible for the transformation of that 500-acre Olympic park. And Andy's thing really is fitting Olympics into the big picture of the city. And we have Bill, in real person here. Bill Hanway is the Executive Vice President of Global Architecture and Global Sports at AECOM. And Bill's had tons of experience, both in London, in Rio, and now is also advising the Tokyo Metropolitan Government and the Organising Committee on the 2020 Olympics here, and the Paralympics, of course. And I think Bill's thing is probably how you fit all these moving parts together in such a massive operation. So what we're going to do is our speakers are going to talk for about 10 minutes, hopefully, on their experiences, and then we'll have a little debate and then Q&A. But before we do that, let's just get the mood of the panel and the room with 3 quick fire questions. So the first question is to the panel: do you think that Tokyo 2020 really will put this city back at the center of the world? Bill, quick yes or no?
Yes.
Good answer, right answer. Joel?
I agree with it, yes, and I just would add one other thing, and you mentioned, Rosemary, that there's 10,000 athletes and millions of visitors and so forth. The other thing which helps put and maintains an Olympic city on the map in the pre-games period and the post is during the games there'll be over 10, there's more media will be here than athletes.
Oh, that's true, that's true. Okay, Andy, what's your vote? Are you going to be the center of the world after the Olympics?
Yes. The question was, will put Tokyo at the center of the world? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. The quick-fire answer is yes. And as it did with London, you become the center stage, and the city is the backdrop, is the theater where everything takes place. So it's a unbelievable and unrivaled opportunity where the city is featured and as much as an actor in the games as the games themselves.
Okay, fantastic. Audience, do we think that Tokyo will be the center of the world after the Olympics? Hands up. Oh, it's not universal. Great, well, we'll come back to that later on. Second very quick fire question, panel. Do host cities need to have an iconic architectural feature for the games to be successful? Bill?
I think it could be a positive attribute for the games, but I don't think it's necessary anymore, especially with the Agenda 2020 protocol that's being established by the IOC.
Thank you. Joel?
Is that on? I agree with Bill entirely. It's nice to have, but I don't think it's a prerequisite. I think the iconic thing, as the games are changing over time with the IOC's 2020, is the legacy and are things sustainable environmentally, financially, and so forth. That's the iconic part of it.
Oh, okay, thank you. And Andy?
No, I don't think you have to have iconic architecture, but I think you should be building great buildings that last and that are signature for the city.
Okay, thank you. And final quick question, are the longer term sort of softer benefits of the Olympics now, brand and civic pride and international attention, are they becoming as important as short-term economic payback?
I think there are. I think it's very easy to look at statistics in either a negative or positive light. And a lot of the publications have recently come out saying the Olympics are not worth hosting in any way. I think that if you look back also, not only on the financial but the emotional side, in London 1 year after the game, 66% of the UK population believes that it was worth holding the games, but also that it was worth spending the public money. So there is a balance between positive and negative responses on all that.
Thank you. Joe?
And I agree with that as well, not surprisingly. And just to build on what Bill was saying in terms of the emotional response after the games to the citizens of host cities and host regions, we went through that in Canada after 2010, and a very similar to the experience with London. One of the reasons that experience was so positive is the intangible. Our national teams in Canada did very well in 2010, and the UK team did exceedingly well in 2012. So the performance of the host country's national team has the long-term impact on the feeling of the population.
Okay, thanks. Andy?
I think there's a very, for me it was very interesting in coming over as an American to London and seeing what I think the long-term positive impact was on, I think, the psyche of the country, of the confidence that it gave the country, the pride it had in the delivery of the Olympics, in the ability to do the mega project and to pull it off in an exemplary way, on time, on budget, and the lasting effect that it had. I think there's a huge amount of pride in that that then translates, I think, long-term benefit, which is hard to calculate in dollars and cents sometimes, of what it does for how a country feels for itself and give it confidence to do other big projects and take on other big challenges.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Andy. Audience, I forgot to ask you about the architecture. Who thinks we need iconic architecture to be successful? Whoa, look at that. I would say less than 10% of the audience on that one. And the long-term benefits? Better than worrying about short-term economy? Probably about 60% of you. Okay, well, thank you. So we've got a mood for that. Now let's get straight into the details. So Joel, over to you.
Good morning and thank you. Initially, I would like to offer a few comments based on the experience that we had in Vancouver, which I think, as most of you know, was the host city for the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. With respect to the impact on the city itself, I'll then move in rather quickly into a few slides that focus on the Olympic venues, particularly on sport venues. Now, a few comments in terms of the context for legacy. For an Olympic cities, the hosting of the games is a massive event. It's the biggest event. It's the biggest three-wing circus in the world, is an Olympic Games. There's really nothing that compares to it. It doesn't matter if you're a modest-sized city such as Vancouver of 2.5 million or a mega city such as London or Tokyo. It will overtake your city. And you have to understand that, and it's a hard concept to understand, but it really overtakes everything. It'll transform, it has the potential to transform the urban infrastructure, not just in the short term, but in the long term. The Olympics, they can be a catalyst for, and we've heard this yesterday in the Healthy Cities, discussion, for accelerating stalled infrastructure projects, across the city. Plans that for projects that have been stalled for various reasons, will get moved ahead more quickly, because one of the things that will not change once the city is awarded the games is the date of the games. That's an immovable factor. So that makes it very different than other, undertaking other mega projects, which are, particularly those that involve, government expenditures. That timing will not change. And that some of those infrastructures, in addition to the sport venues, typically, and not necessarily for the Tokyo, are improvements to roads, highways, airport improvements, transportation systems, and upgrades we've seen constantly over the past couple of decades. The Olympic Games provide host cities a chance to really demonstrate and install new technologies and telecommunication systems. Now, the other side of all of this, and it's hard to talk about legacies in Olympic cities without the idea of someone mentioning white elephants. And certainly there's a lot of examples of that around the world, and they're every host city's nightmare. So one of the challenges you have with legacies, legacy planning, is making sure the approach that is undertaken for the infrastructure and venue development is driven by the long-term use of those facilities and venues over the life cycle, and how that infrastructure, whether it's a venue or a civic infrastructure, will be used by the community in the years after the game, after all the athletes and the world media are gone, because, quote, they'll be out of here 2 weeks after the games are gone, and then you have everything left. So it's really important that they're designed for the long-term use, not just the 3 weeks of the games window. Now, in terms of the Vancouver experience, as I mentioned, 2010, Vancouver hosted the Olympic Winter and Paralympic Games. The Winter Games are the second to the Summer Games in terms of the three mega events that are held globally, the other being the FIFA World Cup on the men's side. Vancouver, did, and the surrounding regions did realize great value from the improvements to games infrastructure, and they went well beyond the sporting venues that were built. For example, and those of you who know Vancouver, we have no freeways in Vancouver. And for a North American city, that's quite unusual. But our public transit system wasn't, had some shortfalls. For the games, the new rapid transit line was was installed, and it became an integral part of the game's transportation plan. But more importantly, it was part of the long-term transportation plan for the city. It allowed us to reform how people moved around the city, got back and forth to our airport, and how it changed the use and the development of public spaces along our waterfront. And the uptake on that line was instant. The projections on it was they would get 100,000 users within 3 years of opening it. They passed that figure within 6 months of its opening. That may say more about the lack of public transit in Vancouver than the line itself. The city also completed a long-planned, convention center, a massive convention center, expanding the existing one that was built for the 1986 World Expo in Vancouver. During the games, it was used as the International Broadcast Center, which is a huge complex, and the former one was used as the International Press Center. The two centers are required for the media. The result of that in the long term is that Vancouver now is able to go out and promote itself and win large major conferences, which has a spin-off on our tourism industry and hotel construction, which we realized after the games. In our suburban city our neighboring city of Richmond, which is out near the airport in Vancouver. That was the site of our the Olympic Oval, the indoor speed skating oval, which post games it was remarkable success in how it got turned around into a different type of venue. But it was part of a long-term vision for the city of Richmond of what they were going to do with developing both for commercial and residential properties along the banks of the Fraser River. And post games, that has worked out exceedingly well, and another success story. So one of the key messages that we got both from the two cities, Vancouver and Richmond, is that the planning for the games themselves needs to involve the city planners. From the very beginning, literally during the bid phase, which is passed now by 18 months in Tokyo, but the city planners have to be involved to avoid the concept of white elephants. Now I just want to quickly turn my attention to to infrastructure. And this slide will go through very quickly. The infrastructure, for Olympic cities generally falls, in terms of capital projects, into three categories. One, there's the competition venues themselves, and we'll talk more about that. There's the non-competition venues, which are things like the Athletes Village, which is a separate type of activity, from all the rest, and the IBC and the International Press Center. Then you've got a series of other and public infrastructure, everything from airport improvements, urban transportation, the telecommunications, and the impact on the hotel construction or upgrades. So generally they fall into three categories. Within the competition venues, which I want to talk a bit more about, again, they fall into three groupings. The first one are the outdoor stadia, and everyone in Tokyo and quite frankly around the world knows about the first one, which is the large stadia, the main Olympic stadia. Where the opening, closing ceremonies and the track and field or athletics events take place. That is a big stadium of up to 80 to 100,000 people. Smaller outdoor stadia are used for other events such as football competitions, and then you have another group of smaller stadiums of smaller capacity of 2,500 to 5,000 for things like field hockey, seven-a-side rugby, and they sometimes those, depending on the site, they can be temporary facilities or at least temporary seatings involved with them. The next category are the indoor arenas and halls, and again, they break into three groupings. The larger ones with capacity of up to 20,000 for things such as basketball and gymnastics. The medium-sized ones or smaller ones for, and some of those are halls for things like boxing, wrestling, fencing, weightlifting, those types of activities. And the third one are aquatic complexes. which you pick up all the aquatic sports, the swimming, the diving, water polo, and they are often the capacity often varies. In addition to that, you have practice facilities. So those are the competition facilities, but all these athletes are here for sometimes up to 2 weeks before the games. They have to have a place to practice. They can't all practice in the main venue at the same time. Then you have this third category, and these are the ones that are really challenging in terms of legacy. And they're sports-specific facilities or purpose-built facilities. And they vary from in terms of how they're managed. And, you know, things like velodromes, rowing and paddling courses, sometimes they're man-made. Whitewater canoe courses where you have to have rapids, you know, built into the facility, equestrian parks, tennis facilities, you know, beach volleyball, which it's often temporary, as we saw in London in the Horse Guards Parade area, BMX parks. They all bring their own unique challenges in terms of legacy. So what does all that mean in terms of some of the considerations you need to look at as you go into as you're in the design and build phase? And some of the considerations that need to be thought of, and it's a really important message here, you think of these when they're being designed and built, and you think about what's going to happen to them after the games. And that's the footprint that you need for the games versus the long-term footprint of the venue after the games, and they usually vary. And the pre-games, you know, the post-games vision for the venue. Will it be, you know, for sport and recreation? And even with that, there's conflicts between high-performance sport and high-performance training and recreation and leisure users. If you think of high-performance sport as F1 cars, and recreation people as people who just go for a regular drive, that's the difference between high-performance athletes and recreation athletes. They're different beasts. So having the thought that they can be used simultaneously for both doesn't always work. Whether they're going to be for a for-profit facility, such as an indoor arena that would house a professional basketball franchise and so forth. The post-games ownership, what's the ownership and operating structure in terms of governance going to be? The financial sustainability, what are the anticipated costs and capital replacement costs? You know, what are the revenue streams? All these things have to be built into a business plan. And what's the competition for some of these venues, particularly on the smaller ones? So those are some of the considerations that need to be, you know, thought through. And again, you know, I guess the flip side of this, what are some of the key questions that you know ideally should be asked, you know, during the design phase? And that is, you know, have the post games use really of the sport venue really been thought through in the pre-games period, and have they been agreed upon? Who are going to be the owners and operators and tenants of that venue after the games? Is there a realistic business plan in place for the post-games use of it? Those things need to really be done, you know, in the pre-games period. And in terms of building it, have the contracts and agreements been in place for the transfer of the venue from, you know, the games mode to the post-games mode? And as I say, the long-term funding requirements and the vision. And just, you know, to quickly finish up, in terms of some of the leading practices or lessons learned, design for the post-games use first, and then fit the Olympic footprint in around that. You structure everything so everything's delivered on time and on budget. That's a bit of a challenge. It has been a challenge in Olympic cities because of the immovable time frame on it, and you can't compromise on the product for the Olympics because the international federations are very strict about the quote playing surface requirements. And remember, each venue is going to be unique and present its own issues. And the bottom line is, you know, start early. Don't wait until the year before the games to think about legacy, or even worse, after. Start now. Thank you.
Ohayou gozaimasu. I was born here in Tokyo, but I have now exhausted my entire Japanese vocabulary, so please excuse me. This talk will now be conducted in English. It is a privilege in some ways to be awarded the Olympic Games. Since the modern games started in 1896, there have only been 22 cities awarded games. So on one side, it's a great moment of pride for any city to be awarded it. On the flip side, how much of a privilege is it to spend $10 billion of taxpayer and private sector money on an event that will last 3 weeks for elite athletes? So those are some of the questions that have to be asked in terms of delivering and looking at Olympic Games. So it is a sports icon, it is part of an evolution of the city, but if you don't take advantage of the issues on the right-hand side to look at long-term legacies, you won't have long-term value for money, and the Games can't be considered a success. When we looked at the Games, we do a great deal of analysis and history over the course of times. Munich, starting on the left, really delivered and developed the first concept of a major park space as a centerpiece of a Games. Los Angeles helped resurrect the Olympic movement and was the first one to make money. Barcelona established the concept of legacy in regeneration terms. Sydney, successful Games, but still having challenges what to do with their facilities and venues even to this day. Athens, we know, contributed to some of the problems that are occurring in the economy now. London has been considered a success, but to the victors go the spoils. We get to rewrite history when it's a great Games, so we forgot all the bad things that had happened along the way. And I know that Andy will be able to talk about some of those also. And in Rio, a lot of challenges, but we see long-term value for what we're doing, but an entirely different set of challenges from working in a global city like London. And then Tokyo, what is Tokyo's final outcome? With Agenda 2020, it provides a new opportunity to deliver long-term value. So this is what we don't want to end up with. We don't want to end up with pictures like this in books and articles stating failure of Olympic Games, even those that were considered a success. So some of these pictures are from Athens, which we know are failures, but some of these are from Beijing, and some of these are from Barcelona. So in London, we started with very simple principles, and in 2003, we were lucky enough to be awarded the consultancy lead for the Games, working with the first mayor, Ken Livingston, who set out these 5 commitments. The first one, really improving sports, tackling childhood obesity, something that is not an issue here in Tokyo, but certainly is in many cities around the world. Creating employment opportunities. The Games have to not just be for that short period of time, although in London, my 18-year-old son got his first job ever working at the Olympic Park, so even for the short term, it works out. Transforming the heart of East London, which is the most deprived area of London. How does a $10 billion investment turn into something that can change the nature of a global city? The fourth one, developing sustainable communities. This is important in terms of the long-term health of East London. And then trying to celebrate the diversity and creativity and innovations held in the culture of London. And then finally delivered by Boris Johnson. This was a challenge. It's an industrial wasteland. It was some 300 hectares of land. We had exposed water mains, exposed sewer lines, overhead catenary electric power lines, all had to be done. So the first 500 million pounds was buried in the ground and no one saw value of it, but nothing could have been done successfully without that solution. But in terms of the way we thought about this, the red area at the top is where the Olympics are held, but it was a solution for all of East London. This is 1986, and you can see that Canary Wharf isn't even developed yet. As we looked at the long-term strategy and the development over the course of time, how does the Olympics influence value and development in the sites around it, but also on the broader spectrum of all the different projects that are going on in the East End? When we design the Olympics, we always look at 3 stages. The Games mode, which has to be a success, the transformation, the period of time after the Games closes before you can develop the land. How do you utilize the land that's available? And then certainly the legacy. Always have in mind what that final outcome is. So this is a picture of the Games site just post the area in circle. We have a temporary facility, the basketball facility, which is a great way of building facilities that you can then take away in the future. And then a beautiful building, the Velodrome, which I think is the most beautiful building on the site. It is not an icon. I think it is just great architecture. We should always be aspiring to build great public buildings, but not see them as icons. The transformation then is, after the Games, you take away the temporary facilities, and you're left with a neighborhood of housing of different scale and character that meets the needs of the local community. We also had a great Games. So that was a 3-week period of excitement, but everything focused on a legacy allowed us to have this platform of a game And the concept of having a park at the centerpiece was hugely successful during the games, and is, that is the icon for the London Games. So, there are lots of statistics that show negatively about what can occur during the games, but I think that bottom one is really the important one. Since the games were announced in 2005, the value of property in the East End of London increased by 60%. And in real terms, that was £60,000 or $100,000. That is significant change in the positive direction for a community that was considered deprived for many years. I've also had the privilege of working in Rio in the last 5 years, arguably one of the most beautiful cities in the world. One that embraces sports, one that has a great culture of parties, but that moment of joy that occurs when you win the games is then followed by a moment of introspection and thoughts of what actually happens. This is a picture of the protests following the economic downturn that occurred during the games. And because the period of time of establishing Olympics is approximately 10 years, you will have a downturn. In London and in the global crash in 2000 and 2008 had a significant impact on how we delivered the games. We're seeing some of that pressure now in Rio. In terms of the city itself, the dot on the right-hand side is the city center, the downtown area. The purple triangle on the left-hand side is the site of Baja. Now, the picture on the right is the heyday of Rio in some ways. It's the turn of the century in 1900. Rio was a beautiful city. The picture on the left is our Olympic site in 1950. So almost no context, but a beautiful location. So once again, the process of designing and delivering a games plan, a transformation plan, and legacy was part of the concept that drove the overall solution. We have a beautiful site to work in surrounded by water. But for us, how do you transform the center portion, which is responsible for the movement of 250 to 350,000 people during the games, into a park space? How do you create one that is turned into a community asset? So the picture down on the lower left-hand side is how the games are operated. The major picture now is what we hope to transform the park into a legacy feature. The other, just quick touching on the transformation of what is a temporary facility. The mayor of Rio, Edward Paez, asked me to look at, I just don't want to have buildings that are temporary and that you take away. Can you design it so it's about component parts that can be removed and built into something of social infrastructure? So taking apart one of the facilities, rebuilding those pieces and delivering 4 new schools is a goal that we're going to be accomplishing in Rio for the first time. So a complete transformation of even the concept of temporary facilities. And if anybody has any questions, yes, it's actually getting built. So Tokyo, closing out on Tokyo, we have the privilege now of working with the TMG and TOCOG on this. It's very confidential, all the work, so I can't really show any images. But it is the first city that's taking advantage of the Agenda 2020, which Thomas Bach is using to transform the way that Olympics are seen. So it provides the opportunity to move facilities outside the main city centers, to save money, to look at legacy as a priority, to look at innovation in terms of energy use and sustainability. And this is a picture, one of my favorite pictures is your governor and Mayor Boris Johnson, and the mayor was being very proud of what it accomplished. London's games have proven to be a mind-boggling success, which has broadcast to the world that we are a dynamic city crammed with confidence, talent, and opportunity. And then this is the look right after the governor said, the Olympics can help Tokyo overtake London. So one of my favorite shots. So the governor has also established some clear points, and he's fully embraced the concept that it's a 100-year legacy. The games are a small moment in time, but that it has to be about the public and private sector working closely together to deliver the games and delivery, looking at the long-term future, concentrating also on the culture of the games. Japan has such a strong and beautiful culture. It can't just be about sports. It can't just be about successful development. It has to become a city that embraces further culture. He's also identified an energy revolution, and this is where I think Tokyo can take advantage of its forefront concepts of innovation, technology, and use that as a way of showcasing to the world what can happen. And then I think one of the long-term prospects of utilizing the waterfront here in Tokyo, it's very much about industrial waterfront. Many modern cities have transformed that. Is there an opportunity in Tokyo? So with that, I'll just leave you with a final quote. from Nelson Mandela, which sort of drives all of our business, which is sports has the power to change the world, and I certainly believe that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. Very clear messages there on planning, master planning, thinking ahead, and great buildings, which I thought is certainly something Andy mentioned too. Now, I think by the look of it, we have Andy back. Andy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Take it away.
Great. Shall I start?
Yes, please do.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, hopefully everyone can hear. I'm going to pick up a bit on where some points Bill touched on about the story of the legacy in London. My main point that I would like to make here is that legacy in London is sort of fundamental to the very DNA, to the very structure of how everything was organized in London. And you have to have the integration of the planning framework with the financial framework, with the institutional framework that's set up in the right way to make sure there's the integration of those factors in order to achieve a successful legacy. And I'll come back and show some slides that Bill also showed, but from that perspective of how planning, finance, and public-private partnership were built into the very structure of the London 2012. So with that, slide 1, you'll see that the Olympics in London, as Bill said, were all about the legacy. It was all about the growth of London. And it was very much a transformational infrastructure project. Slide 2 shows the Docklands, because I will go back to this as Bill did, because the Olympics in 2012 is really a culmination of a 40-year story in London, which is about the repositioning of the city in order to enhance London's global competitiveness. You go to slide 3, you see from what was the Docklands to Canary Wharf, which was that transformation to position London as a global financial center to be competitive in the European Union. And at the time, you have to remember, 30 years ago, London was very afraid of losing economic position. So where does London go? Slide 4 then says, where is London's next wave of growth? London is currently a city of over 8.6, 8.7 million people, growing to projected to 9.5 million people. And the only place to accommodate that growth best is to do that in areas where there's transport and where you can begin to unlock sites that were formerly industrial to create more density and more opportunity for London to remain competitive. And slide 5 then takes us to that next site, which is the Olympic site. This was the site for the London Olympics in 2005 when London won the Games. You see Canary in the backdrop. So that is London's growth from the 1980s and 90s. And as they look to position growth, they look to this site, because underneath this was a huge transport network, but you could not unlock this opportunity because the 600 acres was a brownfield site under many, many different private ownerships. So go to slide 6, and you'll see the Games, the site during the Games. So that remarkable transformation in the space of less than 7 years, 2005 to 2012, how did that actually happen? And all of that happened, we go to slide 7, to a fundamental point that Bill made, and that about Vancouver, which is legacy had to be thought of from the very beginning. The best way to read this slide is not from left to right, but from right to left. In other words, from the Legacy 2020 plan and back to the Olympics. Because you first had to have a bold vision. What do you want this place to be? How is it a part of your city? You then have to do the master planning and set up the financing and set up the institutional structure to deliver that. But it's a lens through which everything was viewed in London. Every decision, every expenditure, every consideration was, how will this ultimately result in legacy? Slide 8 shows the picture that was painted of 2025. What will this site look like in 2025? You then go back, next slide, to 2012. How do we design the venues, the park, how these will be positioned in the city so that they will be best suited toward legacy? Very simple decision, and Bill knows this well because he did this from the beginning, was not to cluster all the sports facilities together and separate them from where residential and future development would be, but to have an integrated idea of the sports venues, anchors for the future development, for residential development. And then we go to the next slide, which is 2005. So that's that transformation of the phasing of thinking from where you are today to where you want to be. Now, slide 11 should get to the kind of fundamental components I want to speak briefly to. And you'll see first is having a bold vision. One must have a bold vision because there are thousands and thousands of controversies and decisions and debates that will happen. And in London, it was clear there was an alignment of the political forces, the private sector, and the community in a very complicated political structure that they had a vision that this site was going to be transformative for the future of London and for the future of East London. They looked at the delivery of strategic infrastructure to how do we achieve that vision? How do they have a public and private land strategy, meaning how will they use those lands, both the public land and the private land, to achieve that? How do they capture land value? The public was investing so much, £9 billion. How do they recapture that to invest in the future of London? And how do they create clear delivery structures? If you go to the next slide, 12, the first way to do that was to have a very clear schedule, as every Olympics does, but that schedule also included that bottom line, legacy planning from the start. You'll see that that bottom line goes from 2006 to 12. As was said about Vancouver, it's not the afterthought, which happens in so many places, and they kind of rationalize after. From the very beginning, this schedule set everybody, the planning of the games, the planning of the transformation after the games, and the legacy planning on a schedule with the clear mandate, political mandate. We do not want white elephants, as was said, and we want to make sure that we start planning and organizing from today for what will happen afterwards. Slide 13 shows that, how they then organized the project to do that. And the government set up 3 entities with focused missions that were interrelated to achieve that goal. The Olympic Delivery Authority was the infrastructure company to build the site. The LOCOG was the organizing committee to stage the games. And then what they set up, which is what I was very fortunate to run, was Legacy Company, set up 3 years before the games, 2009, conceptualized and started even before, whose sole job was to think about not the games, but everything that happens after the games, and to be the master developer of the site, the landowner. So what the ODA built, we were the client. What LOCOG was organizing would leave as legacy, we were the client. So you had a very clear organization of who was doing and how the resources were distributed. Slide 14 shows, I think, the fundamental philosophy in London that's very important, which was, and it says here, 75 pence of every pound spent on it in the long term. We talked about iconic architecture, and I think as Bill pointed out, what's really iconic in London is the infrastructure. There is fantastic and great architecture. But what was really here was to say, as they looked at every investment, they had to ask the question, and I think this is the important lesson, how will this be used for legacy? And how do we make sure the majority of that spend will have a use for legacy to promote our growth objectives as a city? And that was very important. That meant how you looked at the venues so they could be used for games after, how you looked at where venues were sited, what was temporary, what was permanent. If it wasn't needed for permanent, then it was made a temporary venue. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of this. Some similar slides to Bill, but with a little different story. Go to slide 15. just to show this connection. The Athletes Village during games was built for the 17,000 athletes. But it was thought ahead that this would be the first neighborhood on the Olympic Park and to fill a need for housing and affordable housing, particularly in East London. So slide 16 shows that neighborhood in London. The planning, again, was done. What will that be post-games? A neighborhood. The financing was done so that it was sold to the private sector, to a developer and an affordable housing developer, so that they could forward immediately after games and convert that to a neighborhood. And the institutional structure was such that there was a public-private partnership that allowed that development to happen. So this Olympic Village, which I'm showing you here, is now 3,000 units of housing, 1,500 units affordable, and a school is already open there because during games it was used as a clinic. So every piece was thought through. What will this neighborhood be like? If you go to slide 17, you'll see another example, which Bill also showed, which is where the velodrome is on the bottom right, and you see Olympic Village at the top. There's a white box there, which was a temporary venue, basketball. Hard for an American to see that as temporary, but nonetheless, a temporary venue of basketball. And the idea here in the planning was that that was not needed as a permanent venue. So it was sited here so that it could be removed and create a neighborhood. Slide 18 shows that neighborhood. That planning related then to the financing, because what we did as the legacy company before games is had a competition to bring a home builder in, so that home builder was ready. Again, as soon as games were over, they went in, that venue was removed, and they started to build a new neighborhood of 1,000 units of housing. You go to slide 19, you should see the Broadcast and Media Center. This is my third example. Again, a huge venue, 1 million square feet of space, 7 airplane carriers long. How am I doing?
Good.
Okay, just checking my time, sorry. Again, thought through what happens to this after games, and really thought that what was needed in East London was something to transform the economy. So how can we make this a technology center, a center for innovation? So again, 3 years before games, went out, did a competition, brought the private sector in, and slide 20 shows that today, this is being transformed to studios. Loughborough University, a premier sports university, will have research and technology and startup. Again, all those pieces, the planning, the bringing in of private sector capital, and the transformation, all thought of, so as soon as games were over, that transformation can begin to put it into productive reuse. Slide 21 shows the Olympic Stadium, which is going to be a soccer stadium. I'm going to skip next slides 21, 22, and 23, and just quickly go to 24, and I'm about to end, which is the infrastructure and transportation. And 24 shows an entire intermodal transportation center that was built entirely with an eye to the future. This station, which served the Olympic Games and brought people very quickly within 6 minutes from the main transport center in central London to the Games, but was built to accommodate the future that the Eurorail, the Eurostar from Paris and Brussels and Frankfurt could stop there. It does not stop there today, but it has been what's called future-proofed to accommodate that. Again, how to use thinking forward of what was needed. You wouldn't have justified that investment purely on Olympic grounds. It was about the transformation.
Clearly, the message there in this extremely compelling story about the London Olympics has everything to do with legacy. And while we're just fiddling with the little computer there, what I was going to ask Andy, and I'll ask our panelists here, and then we'll throw open to the audience, is simply this. It's fascinating when you hear this story about vision and about the need to bring in private sector, about early engagement. But what's the trigger point where the private sector trust enough in the delivery, in the vision, in the financial aspects of it to come on board? Surely there's so much uncertainty in the process.
Sure, Rosemary. I think I just want to make it clear that over 10,000 people worked on the London Games, and only 2 of us were Americans. It just happens to be biased towards American accents today. It was interesting because when we started the Olympics right after the announcement was made in early 2006, we gathered the top housing developers in London and gave them not a dissimilar presentation around our long-term vision of the East End of London, and asked them at that time would they be interested in investing, and how much confidence did they have that this would become a viable new neighborhood. And of the 12 that were there, only 1 said that they would even consider investing in that moment. As that time progressed, and what we now see is the huge increase in value. Almost every site, well, every site on the plan itself has been done, but it has had a ripple effect, and every site adjacent to the plan now claims to be part of the Olympic master plan, claims to have a view of the site, and that itself has established very, very high values for residential. So I think there's going to be reluctance early on in the process, but ultimately, if you can prove long-term value, it becomes a success.
We're just talking about how the private sector are convinced and engaged at an early enough stage to really make the thing fly. And Joel, you were just going to comment very quickly.
Yeah, we have two examples of that in Vancouver, one successful and one not so successful. And the unsuccessful one was on our Olympic Village. And the initial developer, we've got to remember, we ran into the financial crisis of 2008. And the developer that was building the village, which was at the time was the largest residential project in North America, in that particular time, they went bankrupt. Villages, for another time, they have their own challenges. Where we had success was on the public infrastructure. Public-private financing initiative was the new mountain highway between Vancouver and Whistler. And there was no problem getting private sector involvement on that.
Okay, fantastic. So Andy, Bill, Joel, let's throw open to the audience because we've got limited time left, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So anybody in the audience? Is that Alison? Yeah.
Thank you. Alison Cook from Star. I was just wondering, given it's been a couple of years since the London Olympics, has anyone gone back and tried to quantify the benefits of the Olympics in terms of a return on investment?
Yes, and I'm sure Andy will have comments on this, but there has been a lot of analysis done, and I referenced some of it. In very, very simple terms, increase in value of residential property, the increase in social infrastructure, the analysis done of the return of tourism to the site. Although there was a downturn in tourism immediately following the Games, it was shown that the amount of money spent by each individual tourist was double what it was before. So the actual revenue earned in London was higher than when the population was higher. We've now seen the standard sort of year-on-year growth of 5% returning to London despite fluctuations in the foreign currency. So there is analysis being done. A lot of it gets published in terms of negative light, but there have been numerous successes also.
Any quick comment, Joel, Andy, on that?
I agree with that. And in terms of some of the economic benefits, particularly on the tourism side, as Bill said, depending on the economist and what their agenda is, they'll turn it to whatever they want to find. And tourism, as we know, particularly in a country such as ours, is so dependent on exchange rates.
Yeah, thanks. Andy, presumably the economics of it gave you many sleepless nights.
Yeah, I would just add one point, because I think Bill pointed out some very good numbers, but I think one thing that always has to be thought about here, particularly, I mean, in the London context, which was a 600-acre site and a long-term investment in redevelopment, are the long-term benefits. And that was something that there was a lot of discussion with the government and with the Treasury, that you weren't making an investment just for an immediate cash return to the Treasury. You were making an investment in a 20, 30, 100-year investment in the future of your city. And a lot of those benefits, whether it's increases in taxes, increases in jobs, increases in residents, will be felt over time, and you can't just evaluate it simply on the day.
Okay, thank you. We have time for 2 very quick questions. You first with your hand up. Got a microphone up here, please.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, did London or Vancouver do anything in particular to foster international participation in the PPP projects or in the legacy development opportunities? And is there anything that Tokyo could do so that the heavy lifting doesn't have to be done purely by the domestic development community?
International participation.
Well, I think I'll briefly touch on, I'm sure Andy has some insights also in London, but you have to remember with the economic downturn in 2007, 2008, a lot of the public-private finance deals that were either funded internally or internationally actually fell through, and that's one of the things that we've sort of dismissed over the rewriting of history. And the challenges there were a lot of pressure and step in terms of the public sector to help finance those deals. I think in Tokyo, I don't have a lot of experience in the development market here, but when we have talked to developers, there's a certain burden in terms of the challenges of return on investments in terms of residential because of the aging and closing population. So I think that the promise of what can be in Tokyo and using the 2020 Olympics as a trigger of the next phase of Tokyo's life is actually a great way to go externally to the marketplace.
Thanks. Andy, any comment on London?
I couldn't hear the question, Rosemary. I'm sorry.
It's the question is about international participation and what efforts were made to get international participation early on.
For the funding efforts, Andy.
But, yeah.
Oh, through funding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. As Bill said, the Olympic in London went through a period where there were many venues that had hoped to have been privately financed, ended up being publicly financed. But then as emerged closer to 2012, there was a very concerted effort to bring in international capital. So for example, the Olympic Park was sold. The Qataris were the investors in that with a local developer. The broadcast center, we did a lot of international marketing of that. So there was a very concerted effort to bring in international capital. And again, these are signature sites and it was a signature opportunity. So it was the opportunity to do that. A lot of what one can do, I think, in the lead up, if you plan for legacy in advance, is be out in the marketplace. And we did a lot of international marketing to put, again, one of the earlier questions is it puts your site and your city on the map, and you really need to capitalize on that.
Okay, thank you. Jill, very quick comment.
Just in terms of the two successful public-private partnerships on the rapid transit and the highway, there was nothing special that was done in terms of attracting foreign capital other than the regular call. And of course, being where we are, we get a lot of U.S. interest in our P3 approaches.
Okay, thank you. And one final really quick question. Gentleman here in the red tie.
I just wanted to know what are the lessons learned, or what would you recommend Tokyo do differently, if anything, from the prior successes?
That's a great wrap-up question, actually. Bill, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Just the last part was from the private sector, was your comment?
It doesn't have to be the private sector. I mean, any advice for Tokyo to do differently than the successes that you have seen and you have introduced, like London, Rio, whatever?
Well, I think that the interesting challenge for Tokyo now is the transformation of the protocol based on Agenda 2020. So this will be the first Olympics that has any level of flexibility or real flexibility to move from the bid plan to one that is more flexible and more beneficial for their long-term success. So I think that's where the real challenge is. There's a great benefit to clustering venues to create a real atmosphere and intensity, but that also has financial implications of land use and land costs. And I think if there's a way of looking at distributing venues into wider communities and using those as anchors for further development around there, and that way you affect more communities around Tokyo, I think that would be a new way of looking at it. I think because your public transport is so good, you have that already in place, so that is just needs enhancement, but taking advantage of the wider locations I think would be very interesting.
Thanks. Joel?
Nothing, because the Vancouver experience was a winter one, so it's kind of hard to relate that to where you're going with the Tokyo Games.
Andy, you get the last word.
And the question was, what are the lessons, or what would you do differently?
What would you do differently, and what we could do in Tokyo?
Well, I can't really speak, it wouldn't be fair to speak to Tokyo because I don't know enough about it. I have to say, you know, from my perspective of London, in the big picture, I think a lot of what they did, the lesson learned is the kind of fundamental, which is thinking through every aspect of legacy from the beginning. I think London did a very good job, and as I reflect on it, it really is making sure that that connection is done earlier. If there's one lesson I'd say from London, they might have set up the legacy company even earlier because so many fundamental decisions about the venues, about transport, about so many things, even though they were done, I think, very well from the beginning, would have, I think, even benefited greater if from day one the structure had been set up so that legacy, you know, was built in institutionally to how you do this. But again, the London lesson is a fantastic way of taking a lens to the very long-term transformation of the city.
Andy, thank you. And before I thank our panelists, who I think have done a remarkable job, one very last quick vote from the audience. The professor mentioned that in 2020 we'll have robots to show us the way from the various stations to the venues. Does our robot get the job? Oh, not many. Sorry, double, you'll have to get a bit better. Now, we've had a fantastic debate. I mean, we've hardly scratched the surface because it's such a great topic and complex. I know our panelists are happy to talk over lunch, so can I just ask you all to thank our panel for all of their contribution, and particularly Andy.